Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I have a fascinating episode for you today. I call this episode UFO Investigator'S Disease. There's a little secret going on in the UFO community that you might not be aware of, and that is that many UFO researchers are themselves in contact with UFOs. Often a UFO will be inspired to become a researcher as a result of an encounter, but just as often, a researcher will start researching UFOs and then have an encounter. It appears as if UFOs are researching UFO researchers. This is definitely a thing. I mean, it actually happened to me. I have caught UFO investigator's disease. And that's what this episode is about. The many, many researchers who are having contact with UFOs, either before or following their UFO investigations. And the first researcher I want to talk about is Brad Steiger. Brad Steiger is very well known in this field. He's written a number of books, but what a lot of people don't know is he has had a face-to-face encounter with extraterrestrials. It was an October night in 1940, and Brad Steiger was just a little kid in his home in Iowa when he heard weird footsteps and sounds outside. He jumped up, looked out his bedroom window, and was shocked to see an alien. He knew instantly this was not a human. As he says, I could see his very large, round skull, two pointed ears, and long, slender fingers as they grasped the windowsill. He saw enormous slanted eyes with their vertical reptilian pupils. This ET looked right at him. They locked each other's gazes, and the next thing Brad Steiger knew is he fell asleep. He had missing time. Next thing he knows, he's waking up the next morning. But it impressed him deeply. As he said, a seed had been activated within my psyche. No amount of adult persuasion could alter my personal experience. We were not alone in the universe. There were other intelligences walking about who resembled us, who seemed curious about us, and who might even care about us in some way. And years later, as an adult, Brad was visiting an art show about UFO art and came upon a painting which depicted the ET he had seen as a child down to exact minute detail. He confronted the artist, her name is Shannon Reed, and learned that she lived in a neighboring town in Iowa and had an encounter with what was apparently the same creature around the same time. It's stunning confirmation. But the point here is Brad Steiger's research into UFOs was sparked by a UFO sighting. Is this a coincidence? I'm not so sure because there are a lot of cases. And sometimes ETs will come after a person starts researching UFOs. And that's what happened to Dr. Laurie Vassos, who was a very prominent physician in Canada. And in 1992, he stepped forward and said that he was in contact with UFOs. This came about as a result of him wishing for it. As he said, I wanted to have an experience because I was investigating it. And then in July of 1989, while in Wyoming, Dr. Vassos had his first UFO experience. As he says, and I quote, while I was sleeping, I had some sort of out-of-body experience and encountered this being. It was a humanoid. It wasn't a gray fellow. And shortly after this, he had another and another. He had a bunch of them. As he says, I've had a series of them. I have had several other encounters in which I was taken, abducted. And this was actually quite scary for him. He doesn't think that they are negative or evil, but it did startle him quite a bit. And that's when he went public saying that he had been abducted by extraterrestrials. And this is as a direct result of him investigating UFOs. And I think this is exactly what happened to Bill Hamilton. Bill Hamilton is a very well-known researcher who's looked into Area 51 and other government complexes, perhaps best known for researching the Phoenix Lights. He wrote a book about it. And in On March 16th of 1993, Bill and his wife Pam, also an experiencer, decided that they were going to visit Area 51 to see if they could see UFOs. And they did. An orb-like object approached them. It changed into a disk, then went back into an orb. And as it swept past them, suddenly Bill found himself facing the opposite direction, and he was missing about 20 minutes of time. He had had missing time. And so he and his wife both decided to go under hypnosis, which they did the very next night. And under hypnosis, he saw that this orb of light actually transformed into a disc. Right as it approached his car, it stopped, sent down a beam of light, sucked him on board. On board, he saw a 6-foot-tall gray-type ET wearing a gray suit with a triangular symbol on the side. It had long arms, 4 fingers on each hand. He asked about his wife. The ET said his wife was outside. Bill Hamilton asked the gray why he had been abducted. And the gray said that Bill needed an adjustment and that he would learn some things. Bill was physically examined. He saw computer-like tables which displayed his thoughts and emotions. That's what he believed. The being said his name was Quaylar. It was a pretty short standard abduction experience. Bill was then returned back to the ground and woke up. Both he and his wife saw a car driving away. It was totally silent. And Pamela, his wife, went under hypnosis, and she recalled seeing Bill being taken on board. She saw grays standing around. She said she saw a military van a short distance away watching the abduction take place. She was approached by military personnel who actually detained her in the van during the abduction. And then she was let go, and the ETs returned her husband, Bill. The car drove off, the ETs moved off, and that was that. But yeah, this is another case where UFO investigators are being in turn investigated by UFOs, and it's not unique. This is exactly what happened to Richard Boylan. Richard Boylan is a prominent investigator. He's written a number of books, such as one called Close Extraterrestrial Encounters. He did have an encounter as a kid in his home in Oregon involving a metallic disc, but it was a simple sighting. He didn't believe he was abducted or involved personally in any way, but he certainly was interested in UFOs. And in 1992, he had an incredible experience. He was driving across the country visiting areas like Area 51 and Sandia Labs and other government installations which had been implicated with highly advanced technology, perhaps reverse engineering, this sort of thing. And it was on April 12th, 1992, that Boylan was driving north on Highway 180 between Deming and Silver City in New Mexico when he drove into a fog bank, or what he thought might be smoke. It was so thick he had to stop the car. He got out of his car, and next thing he knows, somebody is grabbing his arm, he couldn't see who, and pulling him towards this craft. This craft was not large, maybe 35 feet long, he said, 12 feet high, and he was pulled in through a door, and on board he saw gray-type ETs. They were short, with dark, oval eyes, no pupils or irises, just pure black, no real nose or mouth, very thin, about 5 feet tall. He was placed in a dentist-like chair, and he felt them sort of sticking something up his nose, up in his sinuses. He believes he was probably implanted. And next thing he knows, he's being floated out of the craft horizontally and back into his car, and he's driving out of this fog bank. And the whole experience left his mind. He didn't remember any of it. All he remembered was the soreness in his nose, driving into the fog bank with vague memories of being pulled out of his car and having missing time. He did recognize that. And he later had more UFO sightings during this trip. He went home, decided to go under hypnosis himself, and under hypnosis recalled this whole experience. And he believes that this was intentional and that this was a result of his own interest in UFOs and his work with abductees. As he says, and I quote, "I think I had an encounter with some non-earthly folks whose craft was by the side of the road. They seemed very benign and left me none the worse for the wear when I got back in my car and finished my journey. Subsequently, the other thing I got from this trip, and I suspect from that experience, is a real sense of urgency to get out the message about the government's secret saucer program and their very current Star Wars agenda. I'm beginning to think this urgent agenda to get this information out may be part of the message I got at their hands." Following this, he also noted a number of paranormal and psychic events, which seems to be related. So maybe the ETs know what they're doing here, because look at what happened to mainstream journalist Ed Conroy. Ed Conroy was a Texas-based journalist who decided he was going to investigate Whitley Strieber's case and find out if it was a hoax or if it was real. Whitley Strieber agreed, and Ed Conroy soon discovered that Whitley's case was real. He called Whitley the Typhoid Mary of UFO contact because it seemed like everyone around him started to have contact at some point. And Ed Conroy didn't realize when he began investigating UFOs that he himself would be investigated by UFOs. But of course, that's exactly what happened. And it started with black helicopters buzzing over his home. He believes his phone was tapped. He was under some type of surveillance. As he says, "Call it UFO researchers' disease or what have you. The complex of experiences I have had in their general outline is well known in the UFO community." His real big confirmation of this came in July of 1987. He was in his home. He bolted upright in bed, absolutely convinced that someone was in his house. Next thing he knew, he had missing time and he's waking up the next morning. And he found a big spot of blood on his pillow. And that absolutely convinced him that he was now a target of the ETs himself. And it scared him. As he says, "I even considered dropping my plan to write a book on Strieber and the visitors, since I had to consider the thought that perhaps my capacity for objectivity had somehow been violated. After all, few people who write about UFOs from an investigative angle ever mention having had anomalous personal experiences. To do so might well seem to one's readers that one had somehow become contaminated by the subject." And he was right, certainly at that time. Not a lot of researchers were admitting to being contactees. But in fact, that's the truth. Many of them are having experiences with UFOs, but are not talking about it. He decided to go public. As he says, "I have come to see myself not only as an investigative reporter, but also a participant observer in the style long adopted by anthropologists who study tribal peoples." He wrote his book, Report on Communion, which gave a positive conclusion that Whitley Strieber's experiences were actually happening. As Ed Conroy says, "I dislike lying, and I refuse to subject myself to the negative psychological effects that would result from making a secret of this material. Objectivity that does not honestly deal with subjective elements isn't worth much to anyone, I think." One of the most dramatic cases of this kind comes from very prominent UFO researcher Raymond Fowler. Raymond Fowler is best known for investigating perhaps the Betty Andreasson case or the Allagash 4. He's a huge influence on this field. And had always been interested in UFOs, but he didn't know why. People would ask him why he researched UFOs, and he just said his interest was so strong that he called it near fanaticism. But he had no reason to think he was personally involved until the spring of 1980, when he was listening to Betty Andreasson relive her encounters under hypnosis, and he himself started to have powerful flashbacks of aliens entering his room, strange figures. He recalled a powerful beam of light coming to his room and seeing a figure floating on the beam of light and coming into his room. He saw small balls of light whizzing around. He had a number of close-up sightings of solid metallic craft. So after getting more than a dozen of these types of experiences and these powerful flashbacks increasing in vividness, he decided that he himself would go under hypnosis. And to his shock, he discovered that he was, in fact, an abductee. Under hypnosis, he recalled being taken on board a craft. And on board the craft, he saw beings there. He was taken to a window, and he looked outside of the window and saw Saturn. He said it looked as if it was right in front of him, close up and in real life. And while inside the UFO, he was told by these ETs that in the far future, he would be helping people. And while this was recalled under hypnosis and is, what he remembered, he does have physical proof, or evidence at least. On August 17th, 1988, he discovered a strange scoop-shaped scar on his leg, identical to those of many abductees he had studied. He showed it to his doctor, who told him it looked like a punch biopsy, which is done by humans for obtaining tissue samples. And after studying his close encounters, he came to the conclusion that they were probably preordained in some way, predetermined, so that he would become a UFO researcher. As he said, "If I did have such contacts, I believe that I may have some linkage to the Andreasson affair. The entity that I encountered indicated that I had been chosen to do something significant for mankind. Could it be possible that I have been chosen to record their message for mankind?" So yeah, that's a good question. Is this being done on purpose? Did the ETs know when Raymond Fowler was a little kid that he would be researching the Andreasson affair? It looks like it. Hard to say, but there are many, many cases like this. Look at what happened to Anne Druffel. Anne Druffel's best known for writing the Tujunga Canyon Contacts, and another book, How to Protect Yourself Against Alien Abduction, and another book about researcher James McDonald called Firestorm. She's very prominent in the field. And turns out she did have her interest in UFOs sparked by an early childhood sighting. It was 1945. She was just a little girl living in Long Beach, and she was with her mother when, quote, "I saw an object or a greasy blob of golden light in the clear blue sky. It then released 15 to 20 smaller shiny objects, which took varying paths out and away from the main object. They were little tiny bits that came out of the craft but didn't fall to the earth. It frightened me." So this is what we would call a UFO display. I think it intentionally wanted her to see it. That's just my assessment, because there are so many cases like this. And perhaps it was intentional, that they did want her to see it, and that they knew she would become a UFO researcher, because this is the pattern that keeps turning up. Look at what happened to Edith Fiore, PhD. Edith Fiore is best known for her work into past lives and possible spirit possession, and she used hypnosis to treat her clients. And it was while she was using hypnosis to treat her clients that she started to run into people who had actually been taken on board a craft. And this really intrigued her. By the way, Edith Fiore is the first person with a PhD to write a book about people who've been taken on board. Her book is called Encounters. I definitely recommend it. At any rate, while she was doing all this research, she became very intrigued about the possibility of having her own encounter and began to send out what she called mental messages and pleas, hoping for a sighting or a message. And it was around this time that she had a very vivid dream that she was taken on board a UFO. And she says, writing about the dream, "My hosts treated me as an honored guest and colleague. I sensed that they were humanoid, not the least bit frightening or strange." She only remembered a few bits of this dream and assumed it was just a dream. However, later she did go under hypnosis with researcher James Harder, PhD, and found out that she was in fact a contactee. As Edith Fiore says, "We quickly discovered that I indeed had been contacted. I had been floated out of the bedroom in my condominium in Los Gatos, California, into a spaceship. Once there, I was treated with respect and kindness, and much was explained to me that I was not to remember until later. Then it would filter into my mind more as memories than as knowledge, and would be very helpful to me." So she felt some ambivalence about this recall, but it was a month later when she really started treating UFO abductees professionally as a psychologist. And in the next few years, she would counsel nearly 50 people who have had onboard experiencers and become a leading researcher. So I don't know if this is coincidence, because it keeps happening. Look what happened to Dr. Roger Lear, who is best known for his research into removing alien implants. He wrote a best-selling book called Aliens and the Scalpel about his research into alien implants. And he himself believes he may have had an encounter. This began with a dream where he found himself in a court-like setting. There were chairs and tables and weird diffuse lighting, and he was shocked to see several figures file into the room and sit down in the chairs. And he says each of these figures was under 4 feet tall and wearing shiny silk-like garments which wrapped around their bodies. Each had a sash belted about the waist, he said, and a hood thrown over the hood and draped over the shoulders. And one of these beings talked to him and gave him a message saying, and I quote, "So, you want to know the secrets. Who do you think you are to ask this of us? Why do you persist in your quest?" And they gave him more messages which he couldn't quite understand. Next thing he knows, he's hearing a loud whirring sound, which is so loud that it woke him up, and he was back in bed. And he wondered if this was just a dream, because it was so bizarre, and then he had heard this sound. And then he found evidence that perhaps it wasn't a dream. As he says, and I quote, "My next conscious thought was that of being back in my room, in bed and lying next to my wife. My daughter had climbed into bed with us and was sitting straight up, staring at me. I must have had a surprised expression on my face. She leaned over and whispered in my ear, 'Daddy, where were you?' I thought I was going to have an instant heart attack. What in the world did she mean?" He meant to ask her, but he never did. But he did find physical evidence that he might be an abductee when he used a blacklight to examine his body and found that his body, certain patches of it, fluoresced under an ultraviolet light. And this is a condition that's well known among abductees and is evidence of contact. So yeah, Dr. Lear thinks he may have been taken on board a UFO, and they were interested in the way he was researching them. And this seems to be the pattern. I'm beginning to wonder if all UFO researchers are having contact, it's just that some don't remember. Consider what happened to Barbara Lamb, who, like Edith Fiore, became interested in UFOs as a result of research into past lives. This sort of thing. Barbara Lamb was using hypnotic regression to bring people back to past lives when some people started recalling past lives as ETs or actual present life onboard UFO encounters. And it wasn't long before she herself had face-to-face contact with ETs on multiple occasions. She revealed this all just recently in 2021 at the UFO MegaCon in Las Vegas. And she talked about how she had a face-to-face encounter with a reptilian in her home, in her living room. She walked right up to it, shook its hand. It was a very friendly, benevolent encounter. On another occasion, after returning home from a UFO meeting in Ventura, she was driving on the Pacific Coast Highway along the coast there, which is a very active hotspot, and she passed by what looked like a strange vehicle with strange people in uniforms around it, and suddenly this beam of light hit her car, and her windshield actually cracked. She was frightened and drove home, and after thinking about this anomalous experience, decided that she would go under hypnosis, which she did with Dolores Cannon. And under hypnosis, she recalled being taken on board. She recalled a beam of light hit her car. Her car with her in it was pulled onto a craft, and these little cute grays surrounded her car. She said they looked very childlike, friendly, just peering in and tilting their heads. They were very thin, almost looked bony. They unlocked the doors and floated her into another room, and she was placed into a dentist-like chair. They put a helmet over her head. They were very excited to find out that she was a UFO researcher, and told her that they were taking her memories, borrowing them is what they said, not stealing them. They made that very clear. They told her that they were contacting many people and trying to learn about humanity. And she learned a bunch of information, and says it was an entirely benevolent encounter. She wasn't scared in the least. And she's since had further encounters. They always seem to come with a purpose or a message. And this is happening to a lot of UFO researchers. Consider what happened to Virginia Oronson. Virginia Oronson became interested in UFO healing cases. She actually contacted me after reading my book, UFO Healings, and wrote her own book, Celestial Healings, about people who have been healed as a result of UFO contact. And as she looked into the UFO phenomena, she began having encounters. She had a visitation right into her bedroom. Once she woke up, there was this weird glittery substance all over her hands. And looking back into her childhood, she found, into her past, she found several incidents which pointed towards contact. So now she's beginning to wonder if she's in contact with the ETs. As she writes, "When I began to explore the celestial healing phenomenon, I did not suspect that I too might have a personal history of ET experiences. Now I would not be surprised to discover that I do. There are indeed a number of indicators that in retrospect could point to a history of some kind of relationship with non-human beings." And in fact, she believes she may have actually been healed, as many people have also reported. So I was really surprised to see how many researchers are reporting this. Another is Leo Sprinkle, very well-known researcher who's written a number of books about UFOs. Leo Sprinkle had a sighting in the fall of 1949 while attending the University of Colorado at Boulder. He saw this metallic disc with his friend. They refused to talk about it to anyone but each other for being fear of called kooks. And it was not long later in 1956, 7 years later, when he and his wife had a sighting again of this anomalous object. As he says, we watched it for several minutes. It would hover, then move, hover, then move. It had no sound and no features that I could observe, but I knew something unusual was going on because I could hear the honking of the horns below us in Colorado. So this was a brilliant red light that he saw while driving with his wife near Boulder, and the object then moved off and disappeared. And this was what really inspired him to research UFOs. It changed his life. He ended up getting a doctorate in psychology. He also worked in the Army for a number of years before this. but he became the first UFO researcher to use hypnosis to uncover hidden memories, missing time in abductees. And he was one of the first real academics to study the subject of UFOs scientifically. So a very profound and influential researcher. He actually was a founder of the popular Rocky Mountain UFO Conference, which was held yearly for decades, and was just a very, very influential figure in this field. And he always assumed that his interest in UFOs was limited to these two sightings and the work he did with abductees. But after getting some flashbacks of weird childhood encounters himself, he decided he would go under hypnosis. And under hypnosis, he discovered that he was, in fact, a contactee and had been since he was a little boy. Under hypnosis, he recalled that as a child in his home in Rocky Ford, Colorado, he was taken on board a spacecraft. Just like Raymond Fowler reported, Leo Sprinkle recalls looking out of a porthole and seeing not only stars, but again, an image of the planet Saturn, lifelike and close up. A tall man stood right beside him and told Leo Sprinkle that Leo should learn to read and write well, and that as an adult he would help other people to become aware of their purpose of their life. So Leo Sprinkle believes, he was taken on board and guided by friendly ETs. And ETs, this is really interesting. Did the ETs know that he would become a very prominent and influential researcher, just like Raymond Fowler? I think so. I really do, because it keeps happening. And many, many researchers are reporting this. They will start researching UFOs, and then UFOs research them, or vice versa. They have a UFO sighting, and that causes them to become a very prominent UFO researcher. Well, look at what happened to Timothy Good, one of my favorite researchers. He's from England. He's written a number of really excellent books, like Above Top Secret and many others. In 1961, Timothy Good became interested in the subject of UFOs and began to read and research the subject. He learned that telepathy often plays a powerful role. He was particularly interested in accounts involving human-looking ETs. Many of the accounts he has written about involve human-looking ETs. And one evening in 1967, Timothy Good was staying at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan, New York, and on a whim decided to conduct an experiment in telepathically trying to contact ETs. For about an hour, he sat in the lobby of the hotel, sending out the mental message, and I quote, "If there are any space people around, let your presence be known." And to his shock, his request was answered. As Timothy Good writes, "Finally, as I was about to give up, a very healthy-looking man, about 5 foot 10 inches, came over, sat down beside me, and took out a copy of the New York Times from his attaché case. Good was amazed and stunned, and he mentally sent out a message saying, 'If you're a spaceman, touch your finger to your nose.' The response was immediate and positive. As Timothy Good writes, 'Without once looking directly at me, he did exactly as I had requested in my silent message.' Timothy Good was so amazed that he was unable to react as the man quickly stood up and walked away. But to this day he's convinced that he made contact with a human-looking ET right there in the heart of New York City." Which may sound amazing, but there are other cases where people have seen ETs in public places. He's not the only one. And in fact, he had another encounter like this at a UFO meeting. This does happen. Another researcher who had an encounter is Malcolm Robinson. He is the author of UFO Case Files of Scotland, Volumes 1 and 2, and several other books. And what many people don't know is that his research was inspired by a sighting in 1970 when he was around 13, maybe 14 years old. He was at his primary school, at Bankery Primary School, playing football, when he looked up and was shocked to see, quote, a white egg-shaped object floating about 200 yards or so up in the sky. He pointed out to his friends, and they all looked at it, wondering what it could be. Obviously wasn't a plane or a helicopter. His friends thought it might be a balloon, but Malcolm Robinson was sure that it wasn't, because it was very large, about 30 feet across, and stationary in the sky. And as Malcolm Robinson says, and I quote, "It looked so strange and majestic in this lovely summer sky. I remember thinking, what can it be? What purpose did it serve? I took my gaze away from the object for only a matter of seconds, but somewhat inevitably, in that small space of time between looking away and looking back, the object had gone. It had completely vanished." And it ended up having a profound effect on his life. I mean, he became a UFO researcher. What's really interesting is he completely forgot about this sighting. He didn't know it. He researched UFOs for years until suddenly remembering this. As Malcolm Robinson writes, "This then was my first introduction into what would later in life mean so very much to me. Funnily enough, in my lifetime of UFO investigating and regularly talking to numerous journalists and television people, all who wanted to know if I had my own UFO experiences, I have never recalled this incident until now. It is only now that this recollection has come back to me. Strange indeed." So here we have that weird pattern again. I mean, he didn't even remember, and yet he became a very prominent and influential researcher. And a lot of researchers are reporting sightings as from early childhood or right after they start researching UFOs. Look at Walt Andrus, who is the co-founder of MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, the world's largest civilian UFO research organization, and still operating today. Way back on August 15th, 1948, Walt Andrus, who worked for the U.S. Navy electronics technician, he was a pilot and amateur radio operator, and it was his job to launch weather balloons, actually. And he was in downtown Phoenix, Arizona with his wife and child when his 5-year-old son shouted out, "Daddy, look, silver balloons." And he looked and he saw 4 round, dull silver objects floating in the northwest sky, moving west. And they were in a geometric formation. They were totally silent. He's absolutely sure they weren't balloons because he's very familiar with balloons. As a weather observer, he launched balloons on a daily basis. A lot of people were there. They all stopped what they were doing and stared in amazement. This was a very brazen sighting, very much in your face, kind of, again, a display. And the objects moved across, flying in formation, and then suddenly disappeared. And then they reappeared again, and he could definitely see that these were thin, disc-like objects. As Walt Andrus says, "You remember it vividly. It makes an impression in your mind that you never wipe out." Following this, he became fascinated by UFOs. He joined APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, which was the only research organization out there really at that time. And later became, as I said, the co-founder of MUFON. I think the ETs may have known this because this is exactly what happened to Jim and Coral Lorenzen, who are actually the founders of APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization. Before founding APRO, on June 10th, 1947, Coral Lorenzen stepped outside on her porch when she saw a glow forming to the south. It increased in brightness until it became a bright ball of light which zipped upwards at high speeds until disappearing off into the distance. She was shocked, and it absolutely convinced her that she had seen something really unusual. As she says, and I quote, "Fantastic as it might seem, there was only one explanation for the thing I had seen. There might be intelligent life on other worlds, and their ships were the strange things people had reported in the heavens from time to time through the years." And it was 5 years later, in January of 1952, that Coral and Jim Lorenzen founded the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, the first civilian UFO research group of any size and influence. I wonder if the ETs knew this. She later did have another sighting on November 9th, 1957 in New Mexico during a huge wave of sightings that was sweeping across New Mexico and Texas in particular, but all across the country. So this is a pattern that is quite prominent. Many UFO researchers, I'm wondering if it's all of them, have had encounters. Maybe some just don't remember, but were influenced this subconsciously. That's pure speculation on my part, but this is so common. For example, Grant Cameron, who is a very prominent researcher. He's written a book about UFOs and presidents, UFOs and musicians. He wrote an excellent book called UFO Bedtime Stories. Runs a very popular podcast. He's a very popular and influential researcher. What a lot of people don't know is he only became a researcher after having his own sighting. This was in 1975 in the town of Carmen, Manitoba, where he saw a bright red glowing object which came to be popularly known as Charlie Red Star. This was a huge wave of sightings which took place during the summers of 1975 and 1976. Hundreds of people saw this object, including police officers and television crews. Many people saw this. Some saw different objects. Some people saw entities. It was a huge wave of sightings in which the ETs seemed to be putting on a publicity campaign, showing themselves off intentionally. And perhaps we know why. They were trying to interest people, announce their presence. It certainly worked for Grant Cameron, and it turned him into a very prominent UFO researcher. I really wonder if this is one of the reasons they're showing themselves to people. I think so, because look at what happened to Peter Davenport. Peter Davenport was just 6 years old on July 17th, 1954, when he went to the Skyline Drive-In Theater in St. Louis, Missouri, and was watching the movie with about 600 other people, when suddenly this bright glowing red UFO showed up, very low. It shined this eerie red light all over the parking lot there. Everybody saw it. He was extremely impressed. This caused in him a lifelong interest in UFOs, and absolutely convinced him that UFOs were real. He held this interest in UFOs throughout his life. He wasn't an investigator, but he did become very good friends with Bob Gribble, a very prominent researcher who was actually the founder of NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center. And Bob Gribble founded this organization in 1974, and 20 years later he had just gotten overwhelmed with work and couldn't do it anymore, and told Peter Davenport that he was giving it up because he couldn't find anyone else to take it over. And Peter Davenport agreed to become the director of the National UFO Reporting Center. And this is how Peter Davenport became a very influential figure in the UFO field. And it all started with his childhood sighting. As Peter Davenport says, and I quote in his own words, "What originally got me involved in UFOs was the very dramatic sighting I had as a young boy. It was at that point that I was committed to becoming the director of the National UFO Reporting Center. It looks to me, and at first it became apparent to me from that sighting, that we are dealing with something that is not manufactured on this planet. The reason I'm the director of the National UFO Reporting Center is because of that sighting in 1954. So there's that pattern again, and this is what makes me think the ETs are doing this on purpose, and perhaps they know that these people will become very influential in the field. They do have the ability to predict future events. They have given people many prophecies which have come true. I've talked to people who've had this experience. So perhaps they are doing this intentionally. And look at what happened to Bud Hopkins. Bud Hopkins is, of course, was at his time the single most influential leading UFO researcher in UFO abductions. He wrote his book Missing Time, Intruders, and many other very influential books. And what many people don't know is he had a sighting in 1964 which got him involved in UFO research. He was driving with 4 friends near Truro, Massachusetts, when they came upon a UFO hovering overhead. They all saw it. Bud Hopkins was driving. Someone else pointed it out. It was a silvery disk. It sometimes got hidden in the cloud banks. The clouds would move by and they all saw it. And it was just hovering in place as if it meant to be seen. And it was not that high up. According to Bud, it was pretty large, 2 car lengths long, he estimates, not moving, and dull aluminum in color. And as they drove closer to it, they actually drove right under it, and it was definitely a solid craft. And as they're watching it, it started to slowly move away. And they watched this thing. They actually stopped the car and jumped out as they watched this thing move off to the northeast. And he said it was actually pretty slow, moved like the speed of a small airplane. And he said, we were stunned, confused, and excited. And he says, one of us, I forget who, said, do you suppose that was one of those flying saucers you used to read about? And this is what really inspired him to become a UFO researcher. At the time, he was a very successful artist. He did not need to research UFOs. Following this, he noticed that a lot of his art was actually featuring these round objects, very much like the one he had seen. So that intrigued him as well. At any rate, it doesn't appear to be a coincidence that he saw this UFO and shortly later began investigating UFOs. So this is UFO Investigator'S Disease. And I can tell you I have caught a bad case of it. And I would like to talk about my own encounters because a number of you have asked me to do this. And so, yeah, let's talk about my own encounters. I did recently speak at the UFO MegaCon in Laughlin, Nevada, where I talked about it. So I think it's okay now to spill the beans and tell you that yes, I have had contact with UFOs and perhaps even more than that. When I first became interested in UFOs because of a news report in 1986, and I discovered that my brother had seen a UFO. My brother Mark, his wife, my sister-in-law, had had face-to-face encounters with short, blue, dwarf-like beings when she was a kid. I had several friends who had close-up sightings. One had missing time. People at work that I worked with had close-up sightings. One, they had encounters with gray-type ETs. Another had missing time. So yeah, this was in my family. My sister had a baby later and had a close-up encounter. 2 nephews had close encounters. So this is definitely in my family. But I personally hadn't had any encounters. I scoured my past looking for anything that might be any clue that I have had some kind of contact with UFOs. And I found nothing, really nothing. More recently, I have discovered what might have been an incident involving missing time when I was about 8 years old. So now I'm wondering, but that wasn't apparent to me at the time. So I just became very much obsessed by UFOs and started researching them, and it wasn't long before I had my own encounter. The first occurred at a UFO meeting down in Santa Monica with contactee Andy Rice, who after talking about his experiences at a little UFO meeting there, took a group of about 20 of us out into the park across the street in downtown Santa Monica and called down a UFO. I was amazed. He actually did it. There were no stars in the sky. The light pollution was too thick, but we weren't out there very long when he pointed to the sky and said, "Here they come." And about 20 seconds later, this huge star-like object swooped down. It looked like a shooting star, but it was much brighter and had a weird kind of angle to it. But it was a bit ambiguous. Still, it was impressive that he could point to this section of the sky and it appeared. That was my first real sighting, and I was really intrigued. It was not long after this that I became embroiled in a huge investigation into a UFO wave over Topanga Canyon. This was in the summer of 1992. I've since written a book about this called UFOs over Topanga Canyon. And during this investigation, I did have a couple of sightings of anomalous lights. Nothing I would really, write home about. But it was in July of 1992 that my family and I went up to Northern California to the Mount Shasta Crater Lake area. And I had a really cool sighting with my brother, Mark, and my sister-in-law, Kisara. We stayed up late one night. The rest of the family was asleep. We were looking at the stars when my brother shouted out, "I saw something." And he grabbed the flashlight and flashed upwards. And we all looked up and saw this bright, bright light flash back at us. It wasn't a satellite, I can tell you that. It was bright. And the light kind of moved out from the sides and it disappeared. Mark flashed the flashlight twice, and this object flashed twice back at us. It was obvious communication. This was a CE5 event. And it was really crazy and really coincidental because it was a month later that I was actually became a member of CSETI, the Center for the Study of Extraterrestrial Intelligence, founded by Dr. Stephen Greer. He came to LA to form a chapter here in Southern California. I wasn't going to go to his meeting there, his presentation, because I couldn't afford it. He was asking for a couple $100, and I'm like, no. But the newspaper, the local paper, The Messenger, called me up and offered to pay my way, and if I would write an article. They said, "We don't know why we're doing this, but we feel compelled to do it." I was shocked, but I totally agreed, of course, and went to the lecture and was shocked when Stephen Greer mentioned two of my own cases, which I had researched, in which people used lights and lasers as a publicity stunt for, radio stations or NBC. They were designed to attract attention, but to their shock, they called down UFOs twice. The main guy says this happens frequently whenever he does his light shows. UFOs will appear. So Stephen Greer was talking about this as a method to call down UFOs. And that night, we went up to the Santa Susana Pass, which is not far from where we were holding a lecture in Canoga Park. And this is a pretty rural area, though it does overlook the San Fernando Valley. And no sooner had we got there was a group of about 50 of us, when someone shouted out, "Look!" And we all looked upwards, and there was this huge blob of light, way up there at the zenith. But it was big. It was about as big as a half moon, maybe, and moving across the sky for just a short moment before winking out. I was impressed. I knew it wasn't a satellite. It wasn't a plane or a balloon or a helicopter or anything like that. It was a UFO. And a much smaller group of us went out the next night, about 20 of us, and had another encounter where weird strobes of light came over our group. I was hooked. We formed a core group of about 10 members, and frequently, well, not frequently, but periodically had sightings with anomalous lights mostly. Over a period of about 5 years, we did this every other month or so, late at night, and would have sightings calling down UFOs. It was amazing. Probably one of our best was again at Santa Susana Pass, where these bright lights appeared, and we communicated at them with our flashlights. They'd blink, we'd blink, we'd blink, they'd blink. At one point, we flashed our flashlights, and they flared. These lights we were flashing with suddenly flared up, bright, bright red, very powerfully, like a giant prism. It was beautiful. I've never seen anything quite that bright. And not a red light, certainly. I don't know how anyone could make a red light that bright in the area where we were looking at it. So yeah, I joined CSETI and I started having sightings regularly with CSETI. And it was during this time I started to have my own sightings. 1992 was really the breakaway year for me. And my first real sighting occurred in late July of 1992 when I was driving home through Woodland Hills. I had just left my brother's house, Mark, and Kisara in Woodland Hills, and I was still on their street, actually, Galandrina. It's a tiny little street, and I was coming around a hairpin corner when suddenly I was going like 2-3 miles per hour around this hairpin corner when a bird came swooping down at my car. I thought it was a bird. It was way high up, 300 feet up, maybe to my right, and looking up I saw instantly this wasn't a bird because it was glowing. I thought, gosh, could this be a firecracker? You know, it's late July. But I knew instantly it wasn't a firecracker because this thing targeted me. It came right for my car and stopped in front of my windshield. It's as close as I am now to this computer screen. It was a foot away, maybe 2 feet. And it was a small golf ball sized orb. Bright yellow, white, maybe a little bit bigger than a golf ball. Totally silent. And it went back and forth, 2, maybe 3 times, stopped. It was right over the hood of my car. And then it moved forward, dipped down, almost touched the street, and went straight up through the canopy of trees and was gone. And weirdly, I completely forgot about it. It left my mind. I did not remember. I now think I had missing time. I don't remember driving home or anything really after this. It was only several months later that I even remembered the sighting. And it took me a while to realize that I may have, in fact, had a missing time. So yeah, that was my first really close encounter, but more started to follow very quickly, in fact. And it was not long after that that I had another sighting. I had a really good sighting with CSETI on July 16th, 1994, where I was heading a CSETI meditation. And there were CSETI groups all across the U.S. trying to call down UFOs. And during the meditation, I got a really strong impulse to look up. And I resisted it first, but this boom, finally I just looked up and this little pinprick of light appeared, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it was like covering most of the sky. And it winked out. I was the only one who saw it, but I was really impressed because I got a very powerful telepathic impression to look up, we're here, look up. And this sort of thing has happened again. It was around this same time that I was interviewing a lady I'll call Wendy, who was an abductee, and her case was extremely extensive. She reported having hybrid babies. Once she reported waking up and finding grays around her bed. She jumped up and kicked one in the neck and snapped its neck. And so I was transcribing her interview one evening in my condo in Canoga Park, and I had just gotten to that part where she had snapped a gray's neck, and I thought to myself, is this real? This is a lot. I was sure she was telling the truth. She's very sincere. She's since become a very good friend. But this was a lot for me to take in. And I'm leaning back in my chair wondering, like, is this for real? How do I wrap my head around this? When I got a very powerful impulse to go onto the roof of my condo. So powerful, in fact, I couldn't resist it. And before I even knew what I was doing, I had grabbed my glasses, which I use for driving. I'm slightly nearsighted, and I ran up onto the roof of my condo. You're not allowed up there. I don't go up there. But there I was on the roof of my condo with my glasses on, wondering what the heck I was doing. I wasn't up there more than 20 seconds when this UFO appeared, right across the street, maybe 200 feet away, treetop level, right above the palm trees there. It was a bright, fiery orange disc, maybe 5 to 10 feet in diameter, very apparent, and it blasted me with a message, a telepathic message. It wasn't in English, it wasn't in words, but the message was clear. And the message was, "Hi, we're Wendy's ETs. You don't believe, huh? She's telling the truth. Watch this." And this thing darted around, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, 10 times, maybe 20, at sharp, acute angles, very high speed, and disappeared. I was stunned. I stumbled back downstairs. I should have called Wendy right away. I don't even know if I had missing time. I honestly don't. I don't think so, but I know that missing time can be seamless. At any rate, I called her up the next day, and I says, Wendy, you're not going to believe it. Your ETs came to say hi and to let me know that you were telling the truth. And she's like, I told you. We had a good laugh about it, and continued to interview her. And as I said, I've become very good friends with her. Still am in touch with her. In fact, I did a YouTube video with her recently called Conversation with a Walk-In. So you can look that up if you'd like. At any rate, Wendy told me she's in telepathic contact with the ETs. And I said, well, I'd like to see a UFO close up, even closer than that, which, I already had a close-up sighting, but I wanted to see them, because I wasn't ready for that. That really surprised me. And she agreed and said she'd get back to me. She called me up a few weeks later and said, okay, the ETs have agreed to show themselves to you. And I was super excited. So off we went to the predetermined location at a predetermined time. This is off the 210 freeway in Pasadena in Southern California. I went with Wendy, my sister-in-law Kisara, and my nephew James, Kisara's son. And we pulled off the freeway. Wendy pointed to this smallish mountain. She said, we have to climb up there, and the ETs will show themselves to you. So that's what we did. And it was a strenuous 20-minute hike. And Kisara and my nephew James fell behind us a couple of 100 yards, and Wendy and I arrived at the top. And no sooner had we got to the top of this little mountain there, or at least top of part of the mountain. There were other peaks above us. And Wendy screams and spins me around and points. She didn't need to point because right in front of us, about 30, 40 feet away, maybe 50. Gosh, it was close. It was like the house next door close. And it was very, very low, no higher than a tree, definitely treetop level. And it was a huge golden sphere covered with lights. It was exquisitely beautiful, as big as a house, totally silent, hovering there, perfectly still for just a few moments. I didn't receive any messages other than maybe, hi, it's us. But no, not really. It was just there in your face. We were screaming, jumping up and down. We were so happy. It was unmistakably beautiful. It was absolutely gorgeous. And it was there for just maybe 30 seconds, breathtakingly beautiful. When finally it started to move off slowly, we ran after it for just a few seconds, because then it started really moving fast and zipped away like a bullet. It moved about 5 miles away in 1 second as it sort of twirled around this in a parabola and went behind the mountain that we were climbing and disappeared. It went so fast you could barely follow it with your eyes, and left sort of this golden tracer. It was really cool and probably one of my best sightings ever. And as Wendy says, and I'll just quote Wendy directly, we looked up and there was that thing, that gold ship that was shooting through. And we ran after it, chasing it. It was so close I thought we could jump high enough to touch it. It sparkled with gold sparkles shooting off of it all over the place. It was awesome. It was pretty spectacular. It was gold. And it wasn't long after that I had another amazing sighting. And this was an actual solid craft. And this was again due to my UFO research with another person who was having very close-up sightings and perhaps even missing time. He has since written a book about how to contact UFOs. He discovered that if you look into the corona of the sun while keeping your face in shadow and looking into the corona itself, not into the disk, you can see stuff that is illuminated in the powerful light levels of the sun's corona. This was exactly around the same time as the Tim Edwards sighting, rather, in Salida, Colorado, in which he used the same method. At any rate, this gentleman, John Wilkie, had discovered this, and he's actually written a book about it, and he instructed me on how to do it. And so one morning in July of 1995, during my lunch break at work, I stepped out of the building and was looking up and saw this huge object approaching from the south, from my left, moving northward to my right, directly overhead. It was huge. It was triangular, well, kind of boomerang shaped, but more triangular. It was huge. I mean, this thing could have been a quarter mile in length, because it was about 1,000 feet, maybe 2,000, 3,000 feet high, but low. I couldn't really tell, but I could see detail on it. It was gray metal. It had a ring on front and 2 rings on the rear, and triangular shape, gray metal. It sort of was almost invisible as it approached, but became more and more solid as I looked at it overhead. It was almost the color of the sky, a sort of a steel gray blue, but was very much a solid craft as I looked at it overhead, many hundreds of feet in length. Could have held thousands and thousands of people. I mean, it was huge. And this thing just moves off, totally silent, to the north. And as it got just sort of at 45 degrees, it disappeared again. It was cloaked. It was amazing. I consider it the best sighting I've had. And since then, there have been others. I've had a number of interesting sightings with lights, anomalous lights. It seems like whenever I write a book, and one of my new books will come out, I'll have a sighting, or if I quit writing for a little while, one will appear and be like, write a book. I don't know if I'm reading into that or not, but sometimes it feels like, yeah, there's a little bit of a message there of them saying hi to me. One time in the late 1990s, I was driving from San Diego to LA late at night. I just visited a friend in San Diego, and looking ahead of me on the freeway, which was quite crowded, I saw a large globe of light hovering over the freeway. It was quite a cloudy night. There was a low cloud cover of about 100 feet, maybe 200 feet. And here's this huge globe of light right over the freeway. It did not look normal. And as I got right under it, I could see it wasn't attached to anything. No other cars were stopping. It's really strange. And I'm looking up at this thing thinking, what the heck is this? When I got a very strong mental message. This thing spoke to me and it said, your niece is born. This was not in English. It was just telepathic knowing. This UFO came to tell me a message that my niece had just been born. It's very strange. These are the kinds of experiences I've had. And it has gone beyond this. I will admit that I think I might be an actual contactee, because there was one occasion when I was still living in Canoga Park in that condo. I no longer live there. So this would have been the late 1990s. When I woke up one evening, because I felt a cat walking across my bed. I don't have a cat. So that shocked me. And I was lying on my side and I opened my eyes and I saw something that was very thin. And it scared me. My heart went thump, 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 thump. I mean, frightened me as this thing darted away out the bedroom door and into my living room. Should have jumped up to follow it and investigate, but I didn't. I didn't react the way I thought I would. Instead, I just turned over and went back to sleep, which is something that, happens with contactees. I've certainly interviewed enough people to know this. So yeah, on some level, I think I may be having actual contact. More recently, I had an experience which I recalled as a dream, but it was a very vivid and unusual dream because I found myself in this room with steel gray walls, slightly shiny, and I was amazed because I'm like, oh, this looks like a UFO. And the walls curved into the floor. There were no corners. And I looked up and the walls curved into the ceiling. And suddenly this 8-foot tall figure approached me. It was wearing a white jumpsuit. It had very pale skin. I couldn't see its face, but it radiated love and wisdom and gave me a little tour of I'll call it a craft. I felt like a visitor. It was very friendly. Took me into another room and pointed to the wall, which turned transparent. And I was shocked as this wall turned transparent, because this is again something I've certainly heard people talk about and certainly read about it. The wall turns transparent, and I was even more shocked because we were underwater. So this was a USO. I don't know. But this is what I've been seeing. I did have another dreamlike experience with this 8-foot tall being, and even more recently had another experience where I was being taught about free energy motors, which really intrigued me because I did a video on this about abductees being taught about how to build free energy motors. And they were showing me one with a number of other people. And then I got to look out a window at an amazing star field. So yeah, I think I might be a contactee. It's taking me a little while to adjust to this and believe it. I don't know. I'm still a little on the fence about it. But other weird stuff is happening, because Wendy did tell me that she was guided to contact me by the ETs, or rather she asked the ETs, and they said, yes, it's okay to tell her story to me. And this happened recently with another contactee who I'm currently interviewing. And even more recently, this year, a gentleman from England called me, and he said, are you Preston Dennett, the UFO researcher? And I said, yes. How may I help you? And he says, well, I'm a contactee. I'm in contact with gray aliens, and I just had a contact with them. They came to me this morning, and I don't know if it was this morning, but very recently. And he said that the gray ETs told him to contact a gentleman by the name of Preston Dennett, who he did not know. And he looked me up and found out I was a UFO researcher. So I'm like, are you serious? Grays told you to call me. They gave you my name. He's like, yeah, they told me to call you. They wanted me to talk to you. So of course we did talk, and it turned out he had been given precognitive information and warnings about nuclear proliferation and upcoming possible environmental disasters. And he wondered if any other people had reported this. And I said, oh yeah, that is their number one message, because it is. This is the message they give to many, many people. So that knocked my socks flat off. I mean, ETs know about me. Are they reading my books? This is freaking me out. The Greys know about me and are actually referring people to me, which is actually really cool. I mean, that's amazing to me. And now I'm wondering if perhaps I have had encounters in my childhood that I'm not aware of. Because there was a weird incident once where I may have had missing time as an 8-year-old. I just remember somehow I skipped lunch. My family served lunch and I wasn't there. I was pretty upset. It's kind of vague, but there are other little pointers. I don't know. But definitely now I appear to be having contact on some level, certainly. And I think I've caught myself a good old case of UFO Investigator'S Disease. And that's why I wanted to do this episode, because I think it's important that people know that many UFO researchers are having UFO sightings, or were inspired to become a researcher because of a sighting, or it's important that people know that if you start researching UFOs, you may very well yourself be researched by UFOs. So that's why I want to do this video. I covered several of these kinds of cases in my book, Not From Here, Volume 2, and I know for a fact there are other UFO researchers who have not come forward who have reported encounters, because I've talked to them myself. So yeah, I think it's probably more common than most people realize. I want to thank you very much for watching. I really appreciate your support. I hope you've enjoyed it, and until next time, keep having fun.